Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Everything good? I feel like I should be able to hear you. I know. Oh, but here we are live. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Oh, yum. I'm Anna Olson. I've got my cup of tea. I've got my chocolate chip cookie. And I'm just so thrilled you decided to spend a little tea break or coffee break with me so we can talk about baking, all things baking. First off, I want to say hello to all of you around the world. I hope you're staying home. I hope you're staying safe. And I hope you're baking because that's why we're spending some time together. I really want to get your questions on baking. If you see me look to the side like this, it's because I'm seeing your questions come in on the thread, and I want to take a minute to read as many as I can. If the stream is just going nuts, and you watch your question disappear, we'll just type it again, and hopefully I will get to it. Now, Jan, right before we got started, let's get right into answering some of these questions. Now, we're talking about baking comfort food, but we also have to be aware of where we are in this time, accessing ingredients, conserving ingredients, not wasting food. So I can handle lots of topics around that, substitutions. But Jan, you were asking about SAF yeast. Yes, generally when it comes to substituting yeasts, brand for brand, and traditional, which you have to dissolve in water, and instant yeast, which you add right to the dry ingredients, typically it's a one-to-one substitution. But I'll be honest, if you're trying to conserve and get more out of your yeast, you can reduce the amount of yeast if you're using instant, if the recipe calls for traditional. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, I'm going to take a minute, read some questions. Hello, Hearts. Hello, Mexico City. I saw Kathy Chuff on the stream there. Hi, Kathy. Oh, one of the competitors from Great Chocolate Showdown did amazing work. What can I replace sour cream with? I missed your name there. Great question. I get asked that all the time. You can use yogurt. Greek yogurt is best because it's got that same thickness. And normally I like to use full-fat yogurt, but in this day and age, you can't just pop out to the store to buy one type of yogurt or the other. So long as it's plain yogurt, that generally works very well in baking. Oh, there's Kathy. Hi, Kathy. Momo, what tips can you give me to make perfect muffins? That's a great question because muffins are something we're making a lot. The key to a good muffin, and that's a quick bread. So these tips relate to banana bread, or if you're making a coffee cake in a square pan, what you want to do is make sure you don't overmix. So if you ever see your banana bread get a peak in the center, or your muffins get a peak in the center, that's a sign of overmixing. And I'll use this opportunity to throw you another great tip because if you're making a big batch of muffins, but there are only 3 of you in the house, and obviously we're staying close now, so you don't have a big circle of friends or the office to share with, to refresh your muffins. If you've stored them and they've gone stale after a day or two, all you have to do is brush a teaspoon of milk on top of the muffin, pop it in the oven or microwave, oven at just only about 325 for just a minute or two, and it'll bring that muffin back to life and it'll be like it just came out of the oven. Okay. Oh my gosh, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. There's so many questions. Okay. I better plan to come back again, shouldn't I? Okay. Hi, Eric. Hi, Yemi. Saludos. How can you replace sugar in baking? Preeti, thank you for that question. There's lots you can do. Now, on a general basis, what I like to use as an alternative is agave syrup that is sugar-free and in a dry one-to-one sugar replacement. If it's not for type 1 diabetes, but managed by type 2, and your family members' needs, I'm a real fan of coconut palm sugar. It registers half on the glycemic index as regular sugar. What I love most about it is you can use it one-to-one in baking. So if you see a recipe call for a cup of granulated sugar, use a cup of coconut palm sugar. Just remember, it's a natural brown color, so your cakes will take on that natural kind of chocolate chip cookie color to them. But I've even used them in chiffon and sponge cakes. Great questions. Oh, Momo, I see you popping up there. Vanilla beans. What are we talking about vanilla beans? I'm missing. Yes, you can use hot water in chocolate cake. Is that question related to coffee? Yes. I like that everybody is weighing in and giving advice, because this is what baking is all about. This is why we're seeing so much baking on social media now, because it's a way for us to express ourselves, de-stress. But as a baker, it's all about that sense of sharing. So I'm glad, even if we don't have our usual audiences to bake for, we have each other right here. Now, hi, Anna, having a hard time finding butter. PJ688, what are good recipes for using oil instead of butter? That's a great question. I have a few good chocolate cake recipes you'll find right here on the OEM channel that use oil. Carrot cake is a classic one that uses oil. And I find when you're making quick breads, so take a good banana bread recipe, if it calls for butter, you can use vegetable oil. Just reduce the vegetable oil by 20%, because remember, oil is 100% fat, but butter is 80% fat typically, unless you're in France, in which it's 84%. Absolutely fabulous. But we're going to use what we have. So that's why you want to reduce the oil, so you don't end up with something that's so greasy. David G, replacing cream cheese. Now that depends on the recipe, David. If you're looking for to make a cheesecake, what you can do that's rather nice is if you have access to a ricotta cheese, which is simply a fresh cheese, but it tends to be wetter. What you can do is puree it and then strain it. You want to put it in a straining bowl with a coffee filter in it. Let it strain overnight. That'll draw out the excess liquid, and you'll find you'll have a more dense, fresh cheese that can be used in place of cream cheese. I hope that's an option that's available to you. Greek yogurt can work the same way. If you add a little bit of extra lemon juice to it, do the same thing, mix it, strain it, you might have good luck. Here's a note. Hello, Anna from Argentina. New season of Bake. Oh, there you go. Okay, well, I don't have a new season of Bake coming on television, but I'm thrilled to say that I have in the works a whole series planned for this Oh Yum YouTube channel. Now, we've been held up by obvious situations. We were actually supposed to start taping this week. So I have the recipes ready to go. The team is ready, but we just have to wait until it's safe for everyone. And then we're just going to run right to it to get you some new recipes. So you have that to look forward to. Look at all those cake emojis. Thank you. Scones. Oh, Hope La Fleur. Good question. Sorry, I just spat that out there. Hope La Fleur. Thank you. What is the best? Okay. I just missed it. Hope, can you write your question back again and I'll look for it? Okay, I need to catch up on this vanilla chat everyone's having here. Now, I see Momo, you're talking about vanilla beans instead of sugar. Vanilla is about flavor, where sugar is about structure and sweetness. So if you're reducing sugar, yes, you can add a little extra vanilla to kind of pump up the flavor, but you do need sugar. If a recipe calls for sugar, it's there more for sweetness than sweetness. It's there to lend structure to your bake. Okay, Hope, I see you. You want, Eve is asking about flaky tea biscuits or soft tea biscuits. Hope, scones. I'm looking for you. What is the best flour? Hope, are you writing from the United States, Canada, UK? Because flours can be different. And I have done a lot of baking around the world, so I can probably tackle that. If you're from the UK, you want to use a plain flour. Okay, you're welcome, Momo. Hope, best flour to use. Generally, I rely on, you're here in Canada. Well, that's great. I just use all-purpose. I don't use cake and pastry. It's too delicate and you won't get the lift. And if you use bread flour, it's too strong and heavy and you'll end up with tough biscuits. I find the ratio is it takes a fair bit of baking powder. For 3 cups of all-purpose flour, I typically use a tablespoon of baking powder in my scones. You can, if you're making a big batch of scones, you can make the dough fully, cut them as you wish. You can freeze them unbaked. So that way, for an occasion like this, you're in the mood to bake, but you don't want, of course, scones are best the day they're baked. You don't want to have 8 or 12 around. Freeze them, then thaw them on the kitchen counter for about an hour before you put them in the oven. And then you can have those freshly baked scones as you wish. I do have quite a few good recipes right here on the channel. So I hope you give them a try. Lemon cranberry. especially here in Canada if you have cranberries in the freezer. Oh, it's so many. I'm so grateful to all of you for taking the time to write. And I'm doing my best to read and talk at the same time. A good question. And I missed your name, so I apologize. But what percentage of dark chocolate do I like to use? Now, it does depend on the recipe. But here's my little guideline is I look to my audience, the people I'm baking for. So semi-sweet, which is more in that 51 to 8% category, is milder and sweeter. 70% is stronger, more intense, bitter. They are interchangeable in your baking recipes, but keep in mind that that bitter 70% chocolate, if you're making a chocolate cake for kids, it might be a little too intense, where using the semi-sweet might be better. But if I'm making something like a chocolate frosting that calls for a great deal of sugar or icing sugar, I go to the 70% dark because it balances the flavor a bit. I hope that answers your question. There's a question from Shabana about how do I dye or color frosting so it doesn't stain people's teeth? Well, you do want to, it is going to happen. And I suppose the only answer is you could use some more natural food colorings, but it's still just like beet juice stains, they stain as well. What I typically do is I try and keep my frostings as subtle as I can. I like the gels as opposed to the loose liquids because you get more color intensity from a small droplet, and that I find that tends to stain less. Keep in mind that if you're new to using food coloring, it is washable. It washes off your hands, off your clothes. Ultimately, it will come off your face and lips too. Jersey's in caps lock made a really good comment, because now who else is making chocolate chip cookies these days? The ultimate comfort food. But you know what? I used the last of my brown sugar to make this batch of chocolate chip cookies. And that's one of those ingredients you can't just pop out and replace. So if you have granulated sugar, for every 1 cup of granulated sugar to create or replace brown sugar, add 1 tablespoon of either fancy molasses is the best, because that's what was pulled out of sugar during the refining process. But you can also use honey or maple syrup, because that replaces that liquid sweetness and lends that bit of color. So you get the proper browning, texture, and chewiness out of your chocolate chip cookies. I'm being asked, I think was that Isabel, am I having trouble finding ingredients in my area? Well, I live in the Niagara region in Canada, and I will say that, yes, the baking aisle was decimated last week. And I think people realize we're here, we're locking it in for a little while. And because baking is such a great activity for kids, I think that's part of all of our plans, was it not? To really take on some baking. What I have been told anecdotally, I'm not a journalist, but I've been told by my people at the grocery store is like the toilet paper thing. It's not a supply issue. It was simply, they need time to get the food back to the stores and the shelves. So hopefully we'll see the flour, sugar, and butter be replaced soon. Okay. Linda McGill is asking about tarte au citron. Was too liquidy. Should I cook the curd longer on the stove? Potentially. That sounds like the case. If you sliced into the tart and the tart didn't set its shape, hold its shape, that's a sign it was undercooked. A lemon curd can be tricky because as you're mixing it, it doesn't change a lot in consistency because the butter is already in there and it's melted. So it's hard to tell when it's thickened, unlike something with cornstarch. So yes, I would give it a bit more time. If you have a digital probe thermometer, use that as your tool, because once you hit 165, you know that those eggs are fully cooked and are as set as they can be. You're at little risk of overcooking your curd because you've got the acidity of the lemon juice in there. That protects the eggs from overcoagulating. Oh, Katie, can you create superfine sugar with granulated sugar? Well, you sure can. You just put it in the food processor. In Britain, it's called Castor sugar sometimes, and that it just allows the sugar to dissolve quickly. Samantha's asking if I have any plans to do a bread book. Well, interestingly, should I give you a peek of what I'm working on? I do have a new book that will be coming out this fall. It's not devotedly a bread book, but the hint is there is a big chapter devoted to some fascinating breads, from the basics, getting into the ferments, classic French baguette, and more complicated breads and enriched breads too. So you'll have to wait for that. I love getting lemon meringue questions, anonymous bunny. Oh, that water, those lemon meringue pies. You know what? A lemon meringue pie is an excellent thing to make when you're locked in, because it's a great learning tool. There's so much to do. You've got the pie dough pastry to make, the filling, the meringue. But yes, that wateriness can be a bit tricky. So a couple of things. You definitely you can make your pie dough ahead. You can bake the shell ahead of time. You want to make your lemon curd and the meringue in the same day, because you want to put that meringue on your lemon meringue pie while the curd is warm. So you make your lemon curd stovetop. You pour the lemon juice in at the very end, so it has minimal contact time with the cornstarch. Now, it seems counterintuitive, but cornstarch breaks down after a while when it's in contact with acidity. So that's why the second day, if you have leftovers, you see a puddle at the bottom. It's just breaking down. It's not spoiled or bad or anything. That's just what happens. I've tried making lemon meringue pie with other starches. Let me tell you, you don't get the same result. I tried making lemon meringue pie with tapioca starch. Yeah, slime. Not what I was after. The other key for you in terms of the meringue, so the meringue goes on top while it's hot, so you don't get that condensation in between. And when you put the meringue on, put a few dollops on, give it a swirl so it latches the meringue onto the curd. Then make sure that that meringue goes all the way and touches the crust so it latches into place. That way it'll stay in place and is less likely to sweat or pull away. So I hope that helps. Thank you again for all these questions and notes and greetings and telling me where you're from. Oh, what recipes? Sophie Chase is asking, what recipes would I recommend for using coconut flour? Now, the great thing about coconut flour is it is gluten-free. So any recipe that calls for a gluten-free flour, you can use that. Remember, though, it's not like using a flour blend. So whenever I see a recipe that calls for 1 cup of a pre-blended gluten-free mix, you can use 2. So for every 1 cup, use 2/3 of a cup of either brown rice flour. Coconut flour works well, but you need to use 1/3 of a cup of tapioca flour too, to really give that baked good its structure. It lends a subtle but lovely coconut taste. I love it for things like banana bread, muffins, quick cakes, things like that. Fantastic question. Amy, ideally, is asking, how long can I freeze my unbaked chocolate chip cookies? Well, that's a fantastic question, because you saw I baked my chocolate chip cookies, but I only made 1 tray because there's 2 of us here and we can't eat a full batch. So I pack mine up in a container and I pre-scoop them, I chill them, and then I pop these in the freezer. And I find in a sealed container like this, they can keep for a long time. Like you're talking 4 or 5 months. I usually put a 3-month cap to it just because of the possibility of freshness or freezer taste. But when they're individually scooped like this, you just pull them out, let them sit on the counter for an hour before you pop them in the oven, and you're all set. So that was a great question. Terror X is asking a good foundation question. Is there any difference between using brown sugar and regular sugar? Well, there is, because it's about the moisture content. Brown sugar has some of the molasses either left in it, so they halt the refining process, or it's pulled away and added back. So you find that that will have an impact on the taste and texture, not just the color of your baked goods, which is why in a chocolate chip cookie recipe, you see it calls for both. You split the difference. Some banana bread recipes call for both. Some just call for one or the other. Are they equally interchangeable? If you've got a moist recipe like a banana bread or a gingerbread, I would say yes, you can interchange them. Is one healthier for you than the other? If you were buying commercial brown sugar, no, there's no difference. If you're buying Demerara, that is less refined. So there you go. I hope that answers your question. Mikey122 is asking, what is the culprit when my baked goods are too dry? Well, that could be, now that's interesting. I'm going to look for you, Mikey, if you can write again. Where are you writing from? Because flours from different countries can be different. So if you're in Canada and you're baking and using a US recipe, I actually find the flour behaves differently, and I'll hold back the flour a little bit. It's not that consequential. You're from Canada. So yes, if you're using a US recipe, sometimes I find the flours in the States can be a little bit different. Conversely, I don't know if you're in the States, if you find that using my recipes there is a difference. I haven't heard anything from you yet about that. I find Canadian and UK flours. So we have to okay, back to your problem, Mikey. We have to talk about this dryness. I'm wondering if the culprit, I'm not going to blame it on you. I'm going to say it's your oven. You'd be amazed how your oven fluctuates as you set the temperature. So just because you set the temperature to 350 and it beeps at 350, doesn't mean your oven is actually at 350 or stays at 350. So what I would do is, if you have an oven thermometer, pop it on the inside of the oven. It's not worth a trip running out right now, just when, later. And then watch, and you may find that your oven is just running and all it takes is about 15 degrees higher, and that cook time on your delicious baked goods could be going too far and they're just a little too dry. I hope that answers your question. I've got Catherine Chase. Do I have any tips for young Canadians who would want to make it in the baking world? Aw, that's sweet, Catherine. If that is directed at particular family members, well, you just keep baking. There are amazing avenues in the baking world, and some people treasure baking as almost like a career hobby, something to do on the side, or it can become a full-time career. Like me, I went to cooking school. I didn't actually specialize in baking when I first went to cooking school. I did baker's apprenticeships along the way. So there are a lot of ways to get in it. I think the best bit of advice I would advise for young bakers keen to get into it is, when you're old enough to get that weekend job or summer job, go work in a bakery or at a restaurant in the pastry department, just to see and watch and get a feel for the activity, because it feels and behaves very different than being a home cook. And then it can really hook you. And then we'll be talking on a different level. We'll be sharing recipes. And I have amazing recipe testers and a team of people who I work with closely. And I just have so much respect for what everyone's doing. Oh, Uruguay. Hello. Nacho Kumare. Lydia James, greeting from Malaysia. Thanks. Lydia's making a coconut lemon cake this week. What would be the perfect frosting? Well, I think keeping it light is key because of the coconut. And you know what? I do love pandan flavor. So how about a simple frosting? It could be a simple buttercream or a meringue frosting, but add some of that pandan flavor, which, if you've never had pandan before, it's kind of the vanilla extract of Southeast Asian desserts. And it's so aromatic and fresh. And I do love it. Oh, Liz, I've seen this question pop up a few times. Thanks for retyping it. Is applesauce a good substitute for butter? Yes, it can be a very good substitute for butter, especially if you're trying to reduce the fat in recipes. Lean towards recipes that favor moisture, like an applesauce cake, a banana cake, a carrot cake. Any wet batter will then benefit, because you need to replace the fat with something that's going to keep the cake holding its shape. And that's where applesauce comes into play very well. So for things like muffins, it should work just great. And any recipe that calls for naturally a smaller amount of butter, then you're going to have good luck. These are just all excellent questions. Ahmed Alam is asking the difference. What is the difference between 00 flour and all-purpose flour? It's the country of origin and the naming system. So Italy has a numbered system on their flours, and a all-purpose flour would be more like a 0 to 1 00 being more like our equivalent of a cake and pastry flour in Canada or in the United States. So it's a finer grind and it's got a lower protein content. When you get into 2, that's more in the bread flour. So 00 flour is great for pizzas because you get that nice crisp crust. So that's a very, very good question. In France, they number it differently. There's so many choices sometimes when you have that numbering system, where here in North America, we rely on the grading system of 3, cake and pastry, all-purpose, and bread. Fabulous, fabulous questions. Tamara Zumbo from Argentina. You know what? Accessing ingredients can be tough. How to replace maple syrup and sour cream, which we take for granted in Canada, but I know you don't have access to. If you've got, Tamara, a fresh queso, I have visited Buenos Aires and Mendoza and Rosario before, and so I think I've seen fresh queso on the shelf. That will do. Or if you have a yogurt product, that will do in place of sour cream. In terms of maple syrup, I have had delicious honey from Argentina. So I would suggest that would make the best substitution. It is a little more thick and sweeter by measure than maple syrup. So I would just reduce the honey a little bit. I hope that answers your question. Oh, and on that note, Liz is asking, or saying you can use honey to replace molasses. Generally, that too. A North American gingerbread cake is made using molasses. A European pain d'épices or spice bread is made using honey. And so, yes, you can. They are interchangeable in many, many cases. Wow, you're writing very quickly. Is everyone having fun? I'm just going to take a moment, have a sip of tea, and make sure I'm really capturing these questions that you want to be asking. Oh, here's a good. Can I make my own pastry flour? Thanks, Karen. That was a great question. Again, whether it's access to ingredients or simple availability, yes, you can. And you don't have to process the flour in any way. But if you buy just a generic all-purpose flour, to lower its protein content, all-purpose flour is 12%. So to lower it to an 8 to 10, more in that cake and pastry flour world, by adding a starch, and a simple cornstarch will do, or potato starch works very well. So for every 1 cup or 150 grams of flour, I will then pull out 2 tablespoons of the flour and replace that with 2 tablespoons of the corn or potato starch. If I can jump in on that same note, because that was a great question, it has me thinking about cornstarch. And you know that the secret to these chocolate chip cookies is that 1 tablespoon of cornstarch in there. The cornstarch holds in the moisture, and that keeps the center of the cookie nice and soft while the outer shell is nice and crispy. But what to do, because let me tell you, I ran out of cornstarch. I accidentally broke my jar holding the cornstarch, so I had to throw the whole thing away, and I haven't been able to replace it yet. You can make the cookies without the cornstarch. You can use potato starch if you happen to have it. You don't need to use tapioca, but you can leave it out. The key is, I learned, you want to pull the cookies a minute sooner from the oven, just so that they're not over baking. The cornstarch is my insurance policy. And then the other tip I find, as I smack the tray right when it's coming out of the oven. It deflates the cookie, so it concentrates oh, look, they're still sticky. It concentrates there you can see it. That density in the center of the cookie, so you get a nice chewy cookie in the center. Oh, Liz ran out of bread flour today and tried to make bread, and it was underwhelming. You can still make bread. Do I have chocolate? Am I okay? I'm okay. You can still bake bread, Liz, everyone, using all-purpose flour. And I have a great little trick. Everyone's heard of no-knead bread, right? You make the sloppy mess of dough, you let it sit, and then you mix it, and a day later, and you let it sit again. So there's a simple baker's process, and it's called Autolyse. And what you can do, Liz, is take your bread dough. Do not add the salt to the dough. So you can add the yeast, the water, up to about 80% of the flour. Mix it just until it's combined. just cover the bowl, let it sit for about 15 minutes up to a half an hour. Don't do anything else to it. And in that process, the flour is hydrating. So the gluten, the protein bonds are bonding and will develop easily. Salt interferes with that. It interrupts it because salt wants to pull moisture to it. So if you leave the salt out, and if you're making a sourdough with a starter, leave that out too, because the acidity in a sourdough starter can interrupt that. So after the 15, 20 minutes, add those remaining ingredients. All you have to do at that point is, whether by hand or in a mixer, if you're doing it in a mixer, high speed for honestly a minute, and by hand, you will feel it. You will feel the elasticity and you will get it back using all purpose. Great question, Liz. Okay, Rubina is asking us a recipe specific question about my grape lollipops. Those are lots of fun. Doesn't have corn syrup and it's not available in India. Ooh, you know what? I'm going to have to come back to you on that one because I'd have to do a research. I wouldn't want to steer you down a wrong path and you not have access to an ingredient. Glucose syrup is an option, but I don't know if you have availability to that. So let me do a little digging. And the good news is, if you are writing from India or the other side of the world, I will be back next week, next Thursday, 9 a.m. Eastern time. So that might be a little more friendly for you in terms of staying up to be part of this chat. So can you give me a week to look into that? I'd really appreciate it. Pointed at asking, how can I make castor sugar from regular sugar? Castor sugar is simply more finely ground, so you can throw it in the food processor. But generally, I find if I'm doing a British recipe, because they're the ones that call for castor sugar, I just simply leave it out, or not leave it out. I use granulated sugar. I don't even do anything. It's only when it needs to be quickly dissolved. What I will actually advise, though, if you're creaming butter and sugar and the recipe calls for granulated or castor sugar, sorry, don't mean to confuse. I'll take a breath. Give it an extra minute to give that granular texture of the sugar a chance to break down a little bit. So that's a little bit of guidance there. Good question. Very good question. Oh, hi, Timsy from Australia. Oh, my gosh. This is such a difficult time we're going through, but it's amazing to see us all come together. And I'm so thrilled that baking is that bond we have. It really does mean so much. It touches me so much that we have this together. I'm not going anywhere. Don't worry. That sounded like I was signing off. I'm still here. Still have half a cup of tea left. The criminal network is asking why my bread is not rising in the oven. That does sound criminal. If it has risen on your kitchen counter and in the pan appropriately, well, it should still be rising in the oven. If it rises and then collapses, that's actually a sign that it overproofed on the kitchen counter. And actually the air bubbles got too big and they just couldn't hold themselves within the bread. And when it stretches the bread so much it collapses as it bakes. That could be one thing. The other thing, you want to make sure your oven is really, really hot. A good, like a basic slicing bread with a crusty outside, you want to bake at 400 if you can, even higher if you really want a well-developed crust. And that also coaxes that yeast to life very quickly and sets it on the outside. If you are baking bread, a great little tip is either a spray bottle in your oven. And what I do too is I'll put in a loaf pan, and before I put my bread in the oven, I'll pour in some hot water from the kettle. And then immediately as I shut the door, that creates steam for enough time that helps really develop the crust. Can I use Moscato sugar in cookies or muffins? Paola, that's a good question. And I think, yes, you can, because Moscato sugar is very much like brown sugar. So any recipe that suits brown sugar can be used. And I've seen some that's dry, some that's wet and sticky like brown sugar. So consider the recipe. Oh, so many questions. Thank you so much, everyone. This is great. This is fun. You're giving me lots. I've got homework to do. Before I come back, I need to look at some of these questions. Room temperature ingredients. That's a good question. Now, the reason I missed your name, so please, I apologize. But the reason I call for room temperature ingredients is for ease, especially when it comes to cake batters, of bringing the batter together. Because when you're introducing ingredients together, like butter, sugar, they come together okay. The minute you start adding eggs, If your eggs are cold, it can seize up your butter, and then you'll find that your batter actually starts splitting on you. So as a general rule, ingredients of a like temperature incorporate well, and butter is always your guide. So if you see a recipe call for cold butter, like a pie dough or a scone, then your other ingredients should be cold. If your recipe calls for room temperature butter, then ideally room temperature ingredients are best. And I don't pull my eggs out far ahead of time. I just pull them out and soak them in hot tap water in their shells for a minute or two before I start using them. Excellent, excellent questions. I just saw an interesting question. I just need to take a minute to read here. What is Demerara sugar? George is asking, and when do I use it? Demerara is a type of brown sugar that has been less refined than commercial brown sugar. So you would use it in measure for measure as you would brown sugar. It tends to be a darker color, nice and wet and sticky, and it lends a really good caramel taste to the desserts you bake with it. Sidra's asking, where can I find recipes for the items on your bake shows that are not on the channel? Well, if you don't see them on the channel now, the good news is we're still rolling out new recipe videos. So until I get back into the kitchen and making brand new recipes and videos for you, you can count on new recipes coming your way. So be patient, they're coming. Excellent question. Oh, Alex is writing from the Honduras. Macaron questions. We could do a whole seminar on macaron, couldn't we? You know what? Macaron are like working with chocolate. It's like speaking a language that if you haven't done it for a while, it can be a little rusty. And you know what? I'll confess, I started a macaron recipe on Saturday and I was convinced I had it just right. And I even used ground pistachios in there and they did not work. And I would say 80% of them cracked. And I realized I over-macaronaged. I over-folded my batter. Now, if you're nervous about your macaron, there are two basic methods. And I have both recipes here on the Oh Yum channel. There's the French and the Italian. I find I have better luck. My luck is the same as yours. Mine tend to crack on the top. And so I find using the Italian method helps me to prevent that. And that means you mix some of your egg whites into your icing sugar almond, and then you whip the other half of the egg whites in your mixer, and you actually boil some of your sugar and pour that. And that makes a really strong meringue that for someone who likes to really fold things vigorously, really helps me out. And when I'm playing with humidity in the weather, I have been known to add half a teaspoon of meringue powder to my dry mixture when making macaron. And I find that gives me the insurance so I don't get the crack on the top, but I get the proper foot underneath. I hope that helps. Oh, Tanbir, why does my Genoise sponge collapse? Ooh, that's a good question. Now, whether you're using electric beaters or a stand mixer, you got to use a machine for that one. To do it by hand, you just won't get the volume in the eggs. But to coax the best volume, which is going to give you the set so your cake doesn't sink, is you want warm eggs, not just room temperature eggs, warm them in their shell. So don't put boiling water on them, but hot tap water, change that out a couple times. You cannot over whip whole eggs with sugar. So if you think you have whipped them enough, go an extra 2 minutes. Then when it comes time to add that flour, you want to work quickly. So it depends how your comfort level is. If you'd prefer to sift it in, work it by hand. But I would rather you work more vigorously and faster than so slow and deliberately, because time is the enemy when you have whipped eggs there. And then you'll see your cake comes up, but then it can collapse in the center. And do keep an eye that your oven temperature is spot on, because it's a big tip too. All right, Melody's asking, what's the difference between granulous sugar and icing sugar, that's sometimes also called powdered sugar? Powdered sugar has been ground a lot finer. And because sugar, when ground that fine, wants to clump up, there's usually I can't quote, I would have to relook up what the percentage is, but it has a percentage of starch added to it, typically a cornstarch that protects, that keeps it from clumping. You still have to sift icing sugar most of the time, unless you're making something like a royal icing or a buttercream, because it's got such volume that it'll whip itself out. But that's a very good question. And they're not precisely interchangeable, but in a pinch, definitely give it a try, only because their weight to volume density is a little bit different there. These are great questions, everyone. And I love hearing where, or I should say reading, you're hearing me, where you're writing from. It's great to do. Oh, Anurag Badahar is asking, can I use yogurt instead of an egg? Now that's an interesting one that I'll be honest, I haven't played with, because I just haven't really thought of that. But your logic makes sense, because an egg is a combination of fat and protein. And when you're replacing an egg with something, that's what you need to replace to add the structure and the texture of an egg to a recipe, especially if you're adapting for vegan baking or an allergy. My favorite is to use ground flaxseed. 2 tablespoons of ground flaxseed soaked in 3 tablespoons of water. Stir together, give it a minute, and that protein and fat from the ground flaxseed replicates in an egg, and that's good for chocolate chip. Have you noticed I've only taken 1 bite of cookie? That's good for things like cookies, muffins, banana breads, quick cakes, things like that. I do like silken tofu as an egg replacer in more delicate things like cakes, cheesecakes, anything with a sort of custardy set. I've used it in butter tarts before for the Canadians out there who love making butter tarts. Is anyone going to be making butter tarts this weekend? It's maple syrup season, and we can't go out to the sugar shacks now, but if you've got maple syrup at home, it's a great way to appreciate what's happening right now, because the trees are still producing sap. Our lives have changed, but Mother Nature goes on. I think it's absolutely marvelous. Oh, Shaylin is asking about adding peanut butter to my chocolate chip cookies. Thank you, from South Africa. Do it. I would add it just before or after adding the egg. And for my recipe of chocolate chip cookies, let's see, half a cup of butter, half a cup of sugar, granulated, half a cup of brown, 1 egg. I would say I wouldn't push it to more than half a cup of peanut butter, but and that would be, I think, about 100 grams of peanut butter. You should be good there. Great questions. Oh, so many questions. Hello, everyone. Ooh, Grace, I love that question. How do you get a cake with no dome? Well, I used to just accept that cakes would have domes. And then I decided I don't need to put up with that anymore. So what I find is in my more recent recipes, and I would say within the last 10 years, if we can call that recent, I put less leavening than I used to. So less baking soda, and I increase my liquid just slightly in a recipe. And I find baking that by reducing the leavening, I'm less inclined to get the dome on top. A trick I recently learned, though, that should it just happen, say you have a recipe you absolutely love and it domes every time, you don't want to stop making it, you could try tweaking, reducing the baking powder. The other trick I learned you can do is right from the oven, pull that cake if it's got a dome. This sounds crazy, but put a clean tea towel on your hand, press the top of the cake down, and you can squish it while it's still, because when it's warm, it's still pliable. You can kind of press that dome down, and then you're not wasting cake later. So I hope that answers your question. That's something I just learned, honestly, a month ago, and it works. I have tried it. Viogence Nord is asking, can I make a sourdough recipe? I have been working on making sourdough at home. So I do have, you'll see in the upcoming cookbook that's coming out this fall, that I will address the sourdough topic in a good way. Okay, I'm going to keep reading. If you don't mind, I think I'm going to stick with you for about 5 minutes more. But the good news is that I will be back a week from now. So Thursday, April 2nd, 9 a.m. Eastern time. So if I didn't get to your questions, because you've been so wonderful and supportive, and I don't want to leave you hanging, let's have another little, it's in the morning. I'll probably have a coffee instead of a tea, and maybe something a little more wholesome, not a chocolate chip cookie. But I'll be back. Okay, so let's get right back to these questions because these are amazing. Okay, I got another yogurt to egg question, but I talked about I want to give that a try, so I'm going to come back to you in a week, and I actually want to put that to the test because I think it's a great question. Atena is asking, how many stand mixers do you have? Well, the TV show had a lot of stand mixers, and oh my goodness, didn't we just color coordinate? But in my own kitchen, I do have two, because quite often we do productions and I need two mixers on the go here, one for prep and one for taking pictures and all that sort of stuff. But I have two, a blue one and a red one. Veronica from Spain. How do you choose the best suitable mold for a cake? Referring to the material. Oh, that's a very good question. Now, it depends on the end result, but for most conventional cake pans, I go for stainless steel aluminum, and you can choose to use glazed or unglazed, depending on how you want to treat your pan. I typically, even with a nonstick pan, I grease and flour the pan if I'm making a layer cake, just to make sure it's going to come out. Any bundt pan, any pan with metal relief, grease and flour so that it comes out well. I like heavy stainless steel trays for baking cookies, for even heat distribution. For pies, I prefer glass because it conducts the heat very quickly. It heats up very quickly, which starts setting the crust before the filling has had a chance to seep through. I generally avoid silicone. Silicone does not conduct the heat. And if you're using a silicone muffin pan, which you have to put on a metal tray to carry it to the oven, I find I brown my muffins on the bottom, but then they don't brown on the side. And in fact, some things can steam. So that was an excellent question. Oh, so many questions. Okay, I'm going to do two more. So I'm not trying to not answer everyone's questions, but do come back and join me next week and we'll keep this conversation going. You've given me a lot of homework to work on, which is good. I have time. Do egg whites actually deflate if you're not careful when mixing them with the batter? It's the time. Okay, generally, when it comes to folding whipped egg whites into a batter, time is your enemy more than anything. The peak over whipping is also at risk because if you over whip, your whites have hit their peak volume. When they hit the heat of the oven, those air bubbles expand and then collapse. That's why you don't use over whipped whites. So if you have a doubt, set the whites aside. They will self-deflate because they're over whipped. You can take them back to the mixer or beaters and on medium speed, bring them back to the point you mixed the first time around. But what counts in a typical batter is that you get those egg whites in. I fold them in 2 editions. I don't worry about the first edition being completely folded in before I add the second because I have that second chance to make sure it's fully incorporated. If it's a really pliable batter and you can use a whisk, it's actually better to pull a whisk because you're pulling the batter and the egg whites without tearing down or breaking down the whipped whites. That was a great question. This will be our last question, but I hope you'll join me again next week. I presume we'll have the time. It'll be Thursday the 2nd, 9 a.m. Eastern time. I've got lots to think about here, and I'm going to, there's so much to review right now, and I'm so glad you're joining me. Let me get this last question. We got, okay, Anna, I see you. I see you there. Why don't your cakes rise? Okay, I got you, Anna. Nice name. I'm not sure. I think I need some more information. You got to help me, Anna. If I really, there are a lot of reasons cakes don't rise. It could be the oven temperature. You're fighting against the oven temperature. If your cakes are rising on the outside, sinking in the middle, that's a sign your oven temperature is off. If they're consistently across the board not rising, it could be your chemical leaveners. And by that, I mean your baking powder and baking soda. They do have expiry dates on them. So you want to watch for that. And I'm looking for Anna. If you've got any more information, maybe we can pick up this conversation. All right. You know what? I'm going to do one more question before we sign off because these are such interesting questions. Ooh, I like this one. Atena Balan. What is the most important thing in choux pastry making? So if you're making profiteroles, eclairs, crullers, anything in that world, choux paste is beautiful. Um, there are a couple of, it's an interesting dough because it's more of a batter, and unlike pie dough, you work with it warm. So a couple of tricks are you heat your milk and water on the stove with your butter. When you add your flour, you want to on a medium heat, not too high. You take that wooden spoon and you really work that flour. So just like I was talking about hydrating bread dough, you want to hydrate that flour so it develops the proteins so that later when you add the eggs, you get that full volume, that airy center in your choux paste. So that's key. Then whether you choose to do it by hand, in a food processor, or in a mixer using electric beaters, when you add those eggs, you want to add them one at a time. You don't add the next until it's fully blended. But before you start adding the eggs, mix that base batter for about 90 seconds to cool it down a little bit. Because if you add those eggs just too soon, they'll start cooking. And then that's actually going to toughen up your batter and you won't get that lift or rise out of them. So I hope that answers your question. And besides that, a really hot oven. And yeah, I think that was really good. You know what? I've got a bit of a checklist of things to do. I'm sure you do too. So I'm going to leave you with all these baking thoughts, my warm thoughts. I think it's fantastic that we had this time to spend together. I hope you'll join me again next week. You've given me a lot to think about. As I said, you have fantastic questions. We're all in this together. So let's stay safe. Let's stay home. Let's stay home and bake. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your support.